The bell above the door chimed at exactly 11:45. It was the same time every day, Monday through Saturday, without exception. The staff at Rosie's Diner on Maple Street in the small town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, didn't even need to look up anymore. They knew who it was. They knew because he had been coming at exactly 11:45 for the past 3 years, and he had never once been late. His name was Walter. That was all anyone knew, just Walter. No last name, no story, no explanation for who he was or where he came from, or why a man who looked like he was carrying the weight of the entire world on his shoulders chose to eat the same meal at the same table in the same small-town diner 6 days a week for 3 years straight. He always sat at table 7, the one in the back corner, next to the window that looked out onto the parking lot. It wasn't the best table, it wasn't the worst. It was just a table, but it was his table, and on the rare occasion when someone else was sitting there when he arrived, he would stand near the door, holding his coat, waiting patiently, silently until it opened up. He never asked anyone to move. He never complained. He just waited. He was 78 years old, though he looked older, thin, stooped. His hands trembled slightly when he held his coffee cup, and his eyes, which were a pale, watery blue, had the faraway look of someone who spent more time in the past than the present. His clothes were clean but dated. A brown corduroy jacket that had been in style sometime in the 90s. A white shirt buttoned all the way to the top. Gray slacks with a crease that suggested he still ironed them even though no one was watching. He wore a wedding ring, a simple gold band scratched and worn thin by decades of wear. He never took it off. Not when he ate. Not when he washed his hands in the diner's small bathroom. Not ever. It was part of him, like a bone or a tendon, something structural, something that held him together. Every day he ordered the same thing: a bowl of chicken soup, a grilled cheese sandwich cut in half, a cup of black coffee, and a slice of apple pie with no ice cream. Every day he ate slowly, methodically, not with pleasure exactly, but with the careful deliberation of a man who understood that meals were markers, anchors, points of structure in a day that might otherwise dissolve into formlessness. He chewed each bite thoroughly. He sipped his coffee between spoonfuls of soup. He ate exactly one half of the grilled cheese with the soup and saved the other half for the pie. A habit that made no logical sense, but that he performed with the consistency of a ritual. He never spoke to anyone, not to the other customers, not to the cook, not to the waitresses, except to place his order, which he did in a voice so quiet that you had to lean in to hear it. And even then, he only said the words he needed to say. Chicken soup, grilled cheese, black coffee, apple pie, no ice cream. Thank you. That was it. That was the entirety of Walter's verbal contribution to the world, 6 days a week for 3 years. He paid in cash, always exact change. He left a $5 tip on a $12 meal, which was generous by Cedar Falls standards, and he placed it neatly under the edge of his plate, folded once so it wouldn't blow away when the door opened. Then he put on his coat, nodded once to whoever was behind the counter, and walked out. The bell chimed again, and he was gone. Nobody thought much about it. People are creatures of habit, and small towns are full of characters. The retired farmer who sits at the gas station every morning, the widow who walks her dog at the same time every afternoon, the old man who eats alone at Rosie's Diner. These are the rhythms of a small town, the patterns that make the days feel reliable and the world feel steady. But there was one person who thought about it, one person who noticed Walter in a way that went beyond the casual awareness of a regular customer. Her name was Elena Vasquez. She was 26 years old. She had been waitressing at Rosie's for 2 years, ever since she moved to Cedar Falls from Chicago to take care of her mother, who had been diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's at the age of 54. Elena had not planned to be a waitress. She had a degree in social work from the University of Illinois. She had a job lined up at a nonprofit in Chicago that worked with at-risk youth. She had an apartment in Wicker Park with a roommate and a cat, and a life that was just beginning to take shape when the phone call came. Her mother, Sophia, had been found wandering in a parking lot at 2 in the morning, wearing a bathrobe and slippers, unable to remember where she lived. A police officer had driven her home. The neighbor who had been watching over her called Elena and said the words that changed everything. "I can't do this anymore. She needs you." Elena quit her job. She broke her lease. She gave the cat to her roommate, and packed everything she owned into the back of a Honda Civic with 200,000 miles on it and drove 5 hours west to Cedar Falls, where her mother had lived for 30 years. She moved into her childhood bedroom and became, at 24, a full-time caregiver to a woman who was slowly forgetting that she had a daughter. The waitressing job at Rosie's was supposed to be temporary, something to pay the bills while she figured out the next step. But the next step never came, because there was no next step. There was only the daily reality of helping her mother get dressed, making sure she ate, hiding the car keys, explaining for the 15th time that day that yes, she was Elena, yes, she was her daughter, yes, she lived here, yes, everything was okay. It was exhausting. It was heartbreaking. It was the kind of work that nobody sees and nobody thanks you for, and that slowly grinds you down to a nub if you don't find some way to refuel. The diner became Elena's refueling station. Not the food, not the tips, the people, the ordinary, messy, complicated, beautiful people who walked through that door every day and sat down and ordered food and carried their entire lives with them like invisible luggage. Elena was the kind of person who noticed things. She noticed that the cook, Big Jim, always hummed country songs when he was in a good mood and went silent when he wasn't. She noticed that Mrs. Patterson, who came in every Wednesday for the meatloaf special, always ordered a second portion to go, even though she lived alone, because she gave it to the stray cat that lived behind the hardware store. She noticed that the teenage busboy, Devin, had started wearing long sleeves, even in summer, and she worried about what that might mean. And she made a point of asking him how he was doing every shift. Really asking, not just the perfunctory "how are you" that people throw around like confetti. She noticed these things because she had learned from watching her mother's mind slowly dissolve that people are fragile, that the line between okay and not okay is thinner than most people realize, that sometimes the only thing standing between a person and the abyss is someone else paying attention. She noticed Walter. She noticed that he never smiled. Not once in 2 years of serving him had she seen anything that resembled a smile cross his face. He wasn't angry. He wasn't rude. He was just absent, as if the part of him that generated warmth and expression and human connection had been switched off, or worn out, or lost somewhere that he couldn't reach. She noticed that he always sat facing the window, but he never looked out of it. His eyes were aimed at the glass, but they were focused on something much farther away. Something that wasn't in the parking lot, or on Maple Street, or anywhere in Cedar Falls, Iowa. Something that existed only in his memory. She noticed the wedding ring, and she noticed that sometimes when he thought no one was looking, he would touch it with his other hand. Just a brief, gentle touch. The way you might reach out and touch the face of someone you love. A gesture so small and so tender that it made her chest ache. She noticed that on Sundays, when the diner was closed, she sometimes drove past his house on her way to the grocery store. It was a small white house on Elm Street with a porch that needed painting and a mailbox that was always empty and curtains that were always drawn. The lawn was mowed, but the garden was dead. There were no decorations, no welcome mat, no wind chimes or flower pots, or any of the small touches that suggest a life being lived inside. It looked like a house that was holding its breath. Elena wanted to talk to him. She wanted to sit down across from him at table 7 and ask him who he was, and where the sadness came from, and whether there was anyone in his life who knew he existed. But she didn't, because she understood instinctively that some people's silence is not an invitation to speak. It's a wall, and walls exist for a reason. So she did the only thing she could do. She served him his chicken soup and his grilled cheese and his black coffee and his apple pie with no ice cream. And she did it with care. She made sure the soup was hot. She made sure the coffee was fresh. She made sure the pie was the good kind, from the batch that Big Jim made on Mondays and Thursdays, not the day-old slices that sat in the display case getting dry. She did these things not because he would notice, but because she would. And that was enough. For 2 years, that was enough. Until the Tuesday that Walter didn't come. It was November, the kind of cold, gray November day that makes you want to stay in bed and pull the covers over your head and wait for spring. Elena was working the lunch shift, and at 11:45, she glanced at the door out of habit, expecting to hear the bell chime. It didn't chime. She waited. Maybe he was running late. Maybe his car wouldn't start. Maybe he had a doctor's appointment. There were 100 reasonable explanations. By noon, she started to worry. By 12:30, the worry had settled into her stomach like a stone. By 1 o'clock, she couldn't concentrate on her other tables. She kept looking at table 7, empty and wrong, like a missing tooth in a familiar smile. He didn't come on Wednesday either, or Thursday. By Friday, Elena was standing behind the counter staring at the door, and Big Jim came up behind her and said, "He'll be back. Old folks miss days sometimes." "He's never missed a day," Elena said. "Not in 3 years." Big Jim shrugged. "People get sick. People go on trips. People have lives we don't know about." But Elena knew, in the way that people who pay attention know things, that Walter did not have a life they didn't know about. Walter had a table and a meal and a routine, and that routine was his life. It was all he had. And when a person's entire life fits inside a diner booth and they suddenly stop showing up, it doesn't mean they went on vacation. It means something is wrong. On Saturday morning, Elena drove to the White House on Elm Street. She parked at the curb and sat in her car for a few minutes, trying to figure out what she was doing. She was a waitress. He was a customer. They had never exchanged more than 12 words at a time. She had no right to be here, no reason, no excuse that would make sense to a reasonable person. But Elena had spent 2 years watching her mother forget how to tie her shoes, forget her own daughter's name, forget that she had ever been a person at all, and she had learned that reasonable doesn't always mean right, that sometimes the unreasonable thing, the thing that doesn't make sense, the thing that crosses a line, is the only human thing to do. She got out of the car and walked up the cracked concrete path to the front porch. The paint was peeling worse than she remembered. One of the porch boards was soft and gave slightly under her weight. The screen door was hanging crooked on its hinges. She knocked. No answer. She knocked again. Harder. Nothing. No footsteps, no voice, no movement behind the curtains. Just the sound of the wind in the bare trees and the distant hum of a lawnmower somewhere down the block. Elena tried the door. It was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside, and the smell hit her immediately. Not a bad smell. Not the smell of decay or neglect or anything alarming. The smell of a house that hadn't been aired out in days. Stale coffee. Dust. The faint, sweet scent of old paper and older memories. The living room was small and tidy. A couch that had been reupholstered at least twice. A recliner with a reading lamp beside it. A television that looked like it hadn't been turned on in years. Bookshelves lining one wall, filled not with books but with photographs. Hundreds of photographs. Elena stopped in the middle of the room and looked at them. They were everywhere. On the shelves, on the walls, on the mantel above the fireplace, on the side tables, on the windowsills. Black and white, color, faded Polaroids, and glossy prints, and everything in between. And in every single one of them, the same two people appeared. Walter and a woman. The woman was beautiful, not in the conventional magazine cover way, but in the real way. The way that comes from a face that has laughed a lot, and loved a lot, and lived a lot. She had dark curly hair in the early photos and silver hair in the later ones. Brown eyes that crinkled at the corners when she smiled. A smile that was so warm, so full of genuine joy, that it made Elena's eyes sting just looking at it. In the photos, they were young, then middle-aged, then old. The backgrounds changed. A beach, a kitchen, a Christmas tree, a garden, a hospital room, a porch that looked like the one outside, except it was freshly painted and there were flowers everywhere. And a woman was sitting in a rocking chair with a book on her lap and a cup of tea in her hand, and an expression of perfect contentment on her face. The same woman in every photo. Hundreds of photos. Decades of photos. An entire life captured in images, arranged around the room like a shrine. Elena understood then. She understood the silence and the sadness and the wedding ring and the faraway look and the table by the window and the chicken soup and the grilled cheese and the apple pie with no ice cream. She understood that Walter was not eating alone. He was eating with her. He was sitting at a table for two, the way they must have done 1,000 times, 10,000 times, over a lifetime of meals shared and conversations had, and silences that were comfortable because they were earned. He was performing the ritual of a meal because the ritual was all he had left. The food didn't matter. The diner didn't matter. What mattered was the routine, the anchor, the daily reenactment of a life that had ended, but that he couldn't let go of. Elena found him in the bedroom. He was lying in bed, fully dressed, wearing the brown corduroy jacket and the white shirt buttoned to the top and the gray slacks with the crease. His shoes were on. His hair was combed. He looked like a man who had gotten ready to go somewhere and then simply run out of fuel. He was alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and his skin was gray, and his eyes, when they opened at the sound of her footsteps, took a long time to focus. "Walter," Elena said. She knelt beside the bed and took his hand. It was cold. The wedding ring pressed against her fingers, hard and warm from the contact with his skin. "Walter, it's Elena from the diner. I'm going to call an ambulance." His eyes found hers, and for the first time in 2 years, she saw something in them besides absence. She saw recognition. She saw gratitude. She saw the faintest flicker of something that might have been relief. The relief of a man who had been disappearing and had finally been seen. "The table," he whispered. "I'm sorry I missed the table." Elena's vision blurred. She squeezed his hand. "Don't you worry about the table. The table will be there when you're ready." The ambulance came in 7 minutes. The paramedics were efficient and gentle, the way small-town paramedics tend to be, because they know that the person on the stretcher is someone's neighbor, someone's friend, someone who sits at the same table at Rosie's Diner every day. They took Walter to Mercy Hospital 12 miles down the highway. Elena followed in her car. She didn't think about it. She didn't weigh the pros and cons. She didn't call the diner to say she'd be late for her next shift. She just followed the ambulance because that's what you do when someone is alone and scared and you're the only person in the world who noticed they were gone. At the hospital, they told her she couldn't go back. She wasn't family. She wasn't an emergency contact. She was nobody in the bureaucratic sense of the word. "I'm all he's got," she said. The nurse behind the desk looked at her for a moment. Then she buzzed her through. Walter was in a bed in the emergency department, hooked up to monitors and an IV drip. His color was slightly better. His eyes were open. He looked smaller in the hospital bed, the way old people always do, as if the institutional setting had a way of shrinking them. Elena pulled a chair to the side of the bed and sat down. "You scared me," she said. Walter looked at her. He seemed confused by her presence. Not upset, just confused, as if the concept of someone caring enough to come looking for him was foreign, a language he had once spoken but had forgotten. "Why are you here?" he asked. "Because you weren't at the diner and I needed to make sure you were okay. I'm not your responsibility." "No, but you're my customer, and I take care of my customers." Something happened on Walter's face then. A crack in the wall. A hairline fracture in the stone that he had built around himself. His chin trembled. His eyes filled. And for the first time in Elena's memory, the old man who ate alone every day showed an emotion that wasn't absence. He cried. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly, the way men of his generation cry, with tight jaws and controlled breaths and tears that leaked out despite every effort to stop them. Elena didn't say anything. She just held his hand and let him cry, because she had learned from her mother's illness that sometimes the most powerful thing you can give someone is permission to fall apart. When the tears stopped, Walter was quiet for a long time. He stared at the ceiling. He touched his wedding ring, and then, slowly, haltingly, like a man learning to speak after a stroke, he started to talk. Her name was Rose. They met in 1968 at a dance hall in Dubuque. He was 20 years old, a skinny kid from a farm family who had just started his first real job at a manufacturing plant. She was 19, a nursing student with dark curly hair and brown eyes and a laugh that made him feel like the world was a place worth being in. He asked her to dance. She said yes. They danced 3 songs. He asked if he could drive her home. She said she had her own car. He asked if he could follow her to make sure she got home safe. She laughed and said, "If you can keep up." He kept up. For 52 years, he kept up. They married in 1970. A small ceremony in her parents' backyard, homemade cake, borrowed chairs, a dress that her mother had sewn from a pattern in a magazine. They had nothing, no money, no prospects, no plan beyond being together and figuring it out as they went. They figured it out. Walter worked at the plant for 34 years. He started on the assembly line, tightening bolts on industrial compressors with a pneumatic wrench that made his arms ache for the first 6 months until the muscles adapted and the work became automatic. He rose through the ranks slowly, the way men of his generation did. Through reliability and competence and the quiet politics of being liked by the people above you and respected by the people beside you, he became a shift supervisor, then a floor manager, then a production director. He never loved the work exactly, but he respected it, and he took pride in doing it well. And every Friday when he brought his paycheck home and set it on the kitchen table, Rose would pick it up and say, "Another week survived." And they would both laugh as if it were the first time she had said it. Rose became a nurse, then a head nurse, then a nursing supervisor at the county hospital. She was the kind of nurse that patients remembered years later, the kind who sat at your bedside at 3 in the morning when the pain was bad and the night was long and the fear was eating you alive. And she held your hand and told you stories about her garden until the morphine kicked in and you drifted off feeling like someone in the world cared whether you woke up in the morning. The hospital gave her an award when she retired, a plaque and a cake and a speech from the chief of medicine that made everyone in the room cry, including the chief of medicine, who was not a man prone to crying. They bought the house on Elm Street in 1975. It was nothing special when they bought it. A small white house with a leaky roof and a furnace that sounded like a freight train, and a kitchen so small that 2 people couldn't stand in it at the same time without touching elbows. But they made it theirs. Walter fixed the roof himself, spending 3 weekends on a ladder in the August heat, learning as he went from a book he borrowed from the library. Rose chose the colors: white walls, blue trim. Curtains she sewed herself from fabric she found at a thrift store in Waterloo. They painted the porch themselves, white with blue trim, and Rose planted a garden that became the envy of the neighborhood. Roses, of course, but also marigolds and sunflowers and tomatoes and herbs and 100 other things that grew because she talked to them and loved them and gave them the same attention she gave everything in her life. They had traditions. Saturday mornings were for the farmer's market, where Rose would spend an hour talking to vendors about soil conditions and pest control, while Walter carried the bags and nodded along and occasionally contributed something useful about fertilizer. Sunday mornings were for church, followed by brunch at the house, where Rose made pancakes from scratch and Walter made coffee so strong that she said it could dissolve a spoon. Wednesday evenings were for dancing, not at a hall or a club. In their living room, they would put on a record, always something from the 60s, something with horns and a melody you could hum, and they would dance in the small space between the couch and the bookshelf, the way they had danced at the hall in Dubuque, close and slow and utterly lost in each other. They never had children. It wasn't a choice. It was just the way things went. They tried for years. They saw doctors. They did everything the doctors told them to do, and eventually they stopped trying and started accepting. It was the only real grief of their shared life, and they bore it together, the way they bore everything, with honesty and tenderness, and the understanding that a family is not defined by its size. They had each other, and each other was enough. They ate together every day, breakfast at home, always. But lunch was their thing, their ritual, their daily date. Rose would come home from the hospital on her break, and Walter would come home from the plant, and they would sit at the kitchen table and eat chicken soup and grilled cheese sandwiches and drink black coffee and talk about their mornings and their plans and their dreams and the 1,000 small things that make up a life shared. And on Sundays, after lunch, Rose would make apple pie from scratch. Real crust, not the frozen kind, with cinnamon and nutmeg and a pinch of brown sugar, and she would cut him a slice and set it on a plate and say, "No ice cream, it ruins the crust." And he would eat it slowly, savoring every bite, not because the pie was extraordinary, though it was, but because the woman who made it was. This was their life for 52 years. The routine, the meals, the garden, the porch, the conversations that never ran out, because when you love someone truly and deeply, you never run out of things to say. Rose got sick in 2018, pancreatic cancer. The diagnosis came late, as it almost always does with that particular cruelty, and by the time they found it, there was nothing to find except the end. Walter went with her to every appointment, every scan, every round of the chemotherapy that the oncologist offered, not as a cure, but as a way to buy time, the medical equivalent of holding the door open for a few extra months. He sat in waiting rooms and read, magazines he didn't care about, and drank coffee from styrofoam cups and watched the clock and counted the minutes until he could be back at her side. Rose handled it the way she handled everything, with grace, with humor, with the unshakable calm of a woman who had spent 40 years as a nurse and understood better than anyone that death is not the enemy. Suffering is, and suffering can be managed. She made him laugh during her treatments. She told jokes to the nurses. She organized her medications with the precision of a military operation and kept a spreadsheet of her vitals that the oncologist said was more detailed than anything his staff produced. She was dying, and she was still the most competent person in the room. But at night, when the house was quiet and the medications wore off and the pain crept in like a tide, she would reach across the bed and take Walter's hand. And she would hold it. Not tightly, just firmly, the way you hold on to something when you know you're going to have to let go. She died 4 months later, in their bedroom, in their bed, with Walter holding her hand and telling her that he loved her and that the garden was fine and that the porch needed painting and that he would do it in the spring. All the small, ordinary, beautiful lies that people tell the dying to make the world seem like it will keep going. The last thing she said was, "Don't eat alone, Walter. Promise me." He promised. After the funeral, the house became a tomb. The garden died because Walter didn't know how to take care of it and couldn't bring himself to learn. The porch paint peeled because he couldn't climb the ladder anymore and couldn't bear to ask someone else to do it. Rose's clothes hung in the closet. Her books sat on the shelves, organized by color. Her reading glasses were still on the nightstand. Her robe was still on the hook behind the bathroom door. He didn't move any of it. He couldn't. Moving it would mean accepting that she was gone. And he wasn't ready. He would never be ready. The silence was the worst part. For 52 years, the house had been full of sound. Rose's voice, Rose's laugh, Rose humming in the kitchen, Rose singing along to the radio, Rose talking to the plants, Rose calling his name from the garden. The house had been alive with her, vibrating with her energy, and now it was silent. Completely, devastatingly, permanently silent. Walter stopped eating at home. He couldn't sit at the kitchen table where they had shared 10,000 lunches and eat alone. The chair across from him was empty, and the emptiness was so loud that it drowned out everything else. And the next week, he walked into Rosie's diner for the first time. He chose the diner because it reminded him of a place they used to eat when they were young. A little lunch counter in Dubuque with a bell above the door and checkered tablecloths and a waitress who knew their names. He chose table 7 because it was in the corner where he could sit quietly and no one would bother him. He ordered chicken soup and grilled cheese and black coffee and apple pie with no ice cream because that was what they ate. That was their meal, their ritual, the daily sacrament of a love that had lasted half a century and that he was not ready to release. He wasn't eating alone, not in his mind. In his mind, she was sitting across from him. In his mind, she was telling him about her morning. In his mind, she was laughing that laugh and touching his hand and stealing a bite of his grilled cheese the way she always did, even though she had her own, because food always tastes better when it's stolen from someone you love. He kept his promise. He never ate alone. He ate with Rose every day for 3 years until his body finally started to fail the way bodies do when the heart inside them is broken and the will to keep going is held together by nothing more than a promise and a routine. Elena sat in the hospital room and listened to all of this. She listened the way she listened to everything, with her whole self, with the attention and the care and the reverence that a story like this demands. And when Walter was finished, she understood something that changed her. She understood that loneliness is not the absence of people. It's the absence of being known. Walter was surrounded by people every day at the diner, waitresses and cooks and customers and strangers, but none of them knew him. None of them knew about Rose or the garden or the apple pie or the promise. None of them knew that the old man in the corner with the faraway eyes was performing an act of love so quiet and so profound that it made the noise of the world seem trivial by comparison. He had been invisible, not because people were cruel, but because people were busy, because people were distracted, because people had their own lives and their own problems and their own grief. And it was easy, so heartbreakingly easy, to look at an old man eating soup and see nothing. Elena had seen something. Not everything, Not enough, but something. And now that she had the full picture, she knew that seeing was not enough. Action was required. She called her cousin Maria, who was a social worker at the county's Elder Services Department. She called Walter's doctor and got a full update on his condition: dehydration, malnutrition, a heart condition that had been undiagnosed and untreated for at least 2 years. Not critical, but serious. The kind of thing that happens when a person stops taking care of themselves because the person they were living for is gone. She called the diner and told Big Jim she needed the week off. Big Jim, who had the emotional range of a brick and the heart of a golden retriever, told her to take as long as she needed and that he'd cover her shifts himself. She spent the next 7 days at Walter's side. She brought him chicken soup from the diner. She brought him grilled cheese cut in half. She brought him black coffee and a slice of apple pie with no ice cream. She set it on the tray beside his bed, and when he looked at her with those pale blue eyes and said, "You didn't have to do this," she said, "I know, but Rose would have wanted you to eat." It was the first time anyone had said Rose's name to him in 3 years. The sound of it in someone else's mouth, spoken with kindness, spoken with respect, spoken as if Rose were a real person and not just a ghost that haunted a corner booth, broke something open in Walter that had been sealed shut since the funeral. He talked about her all week. He told Elena about the dance in 1968, about the wedding in her parents' backyard, about the house on Elm Street and the garden and the porch, about the nursing career and the retirement party and the trip to Italy they took for their 40th anniversary, where Rose ate so much gelato that she said she was never coming home. About the small things, the way she hummed when she cooked, the way she organized the bookshelves by color instead of author, because she said books should be beautiful before they're useful, the way she could never resist petting a dog, any dog, even dogs that clearly did not want to be petted. He talked about her as if she were still alive. And in a way, for that week, she was, because someone was listening, someone was receiving the stories, someone was holding the memory of Rose Whitfield in their hands with care and attention, and that meant she existed again, not just in Walter's fading mind, but in the world. Elena cried multiple times. She cried in the hospital bathroom when no one was looking. She cried in her car in the parking lot. She cried at home, sitting on the edge of her bed, thinking about her own mother, who was losing her memories one by one like sand slipping through an hourglass, and about Walter, who had a lifetime of memories and no one to share them with. She cried because the world is full of people like Walter, people who carry entire universes inside them, people whose stories would break your heart and mend it at the same time if you only bothered to ask, people who sit alone at corner tables and eat their chicken soup and say thank you and leave a $5 tip and walk out the door and disappear into the grayness of a November afternoon, unseen and unknown and utterly, devastatingly alone. Walter was released from the hospital 10 days later. Maria, Elena's cousin, had arranged home health visits 3 times a week. A nurse would come to check his vitals, manage his medication, and make sure he was eating. Elena had stocked his refrigerator with groceries and left a list of phone numbers on the kitchen counter, including her own, written in large letters with the instruction, "Call anytime." I mean it. On his first day home, Walter stood in his living room and looked at the photographs. Hundreds of them. Rose on the beach, Rose in the garden, Rose at Christmas, Rose in the hospital, thin and pale, but still smiling, still beautiful, still the woman he had asked to dance in 1968. He touched the nearest photograph. Rose on the porch, in the rocking chair with the book and the tea. He traced the outline of her face with his trembling finger. "I kept my promise," he whispered. "I never ate alone." The next day, at 11:45, the bell above the door at Rosie's diner chimed. Elena looked up, and there he was. Brown corduroy jacket, white shirt buttoned to the top, gray slacks with the crease, walking slowly, carefully, but walking, moving through the diner with the deliberate purpose of a man who has somewhere to be. He sat down at table 7. Elena came over with a coffee pot and a menu he didn't need. "The usual?" she asked. He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, the old man who ate alone every day did something that made Elena's heart crack wide open. He smiled. It was small. It was tentative. It was the rusty, unpracticed smile of a face that had forgotten how to make that shape. but it was there, real, human, alive. The usual, he said. Then he paused. And Elena? Yes, Walter? Would you like to sit down? When you have a minute? Elena looked at him. She looked at the empty seat across from him at table 7. The seat that had been empty for 3 years. The seat that belonged to Rose. I'd love to, she said. She brought him his chicken soup and his grilled cheese and his black coffee. She brought herself a cup of coffee too. And she sat down across from him at table 7 in Rose's seat. And she asked him to tell her about the dance in 1968. And he did. He told her all of it, from the beginning. And this time, he wasn't eating alone. From that day forward, things changed. Not dramatically, not overnight, the way real things change, slowly, like seasons turning. Elena sat with Walter every day during her break, sometimes for 5 minutes, sometimes for 30. They talked about Rose. They talked about Elena's mother. They talked about Big Jim's cooking, and the weather, and the news, and the 1,000 small things that make up a conversation between two people who have decided to pay attention to each other. Other people at the diner started to notice. Mrs. Henderson, who came in every Wednesday, asked Elena about the old man in the corner. Elena told her his name was Walter and that he had been married to the love of his life for 52 years and that she had passed away and that he came to the diner every day because he had promised her he would never eat alone. Mrs. Henderson went home and told her husband. Her husband told someone at the barber shop. The barber shop told the hardware store. The hardware store told the church. Within a month, Walter was no longer eating alone at table 7. People came, not in a rush, not in a crowd, one at a time, the way kindness works when it's genuine and not performed for an audience. They came and they sat across from him, and they asked him about himself, and they listened, really listened, the way Elena listened, with attention and care and the understanding that every person on earth has a story worth hearing. The retired farmer who sat at the gas station every morning started coming to Rosie's at 11:45 instead. His name was Earl, and he was 81 years old, and he had lost his own wife 2 years before Walter lost Rose. They sat together and talked about crops and weather and the old days and the women they had loved, and they discovered that grief shared is not grief halved, exactly, but it is grief understood, and understanding is its own kind of comfort. The librarian, a quiet woman named June with glasses and a cardigan and an encyclopedic knowledge of 20th century fiction, brought Walter books she thought he might like. She sat with him while he ate and told him about the new additions to the collection. She recommended a novel about a man who writes letters to his dead wife, and Walter read it in 2 days and came back to the diner with red eyes and told June it was the best book he had ever read. The high school music teacher, when she heard about Rose and the dance in Dubuque, brought Walter a CD of big band music from the 1960s. He listened to it on a portable player that Elena bought him, and he cried, and then he smiled, and then he asked the teacher if she knew how to jitterbug. She didn't, but she learned. A group of women from the Methodist Church started a rotation. 2 of them would come to the diner every day at 11:45 and sit with Walter. They brought him homemade cookies and quilted blankets and stories about their grandchildren. One of them, a 70-year-old woman named Betty, who had been widowed 3 times and said she was done with men but not with lunch, became Walter's closest friend after Elena. She sat with him every Monday and Thursday and told him jokes that were so terrible they were funny, and he laughed in a way that Elena had never heard before, a real, deep belly laugh that shook his thin frame and made the whole diner turn and look. Someone organized a crew to paint Walter's porch. They showed up on a Saturday morning, 6 of them, with brushes and rollers and 3 gallons of white paint and 1 gallon of blue for the trim. Walter stood on the lawn and watched them work, and when they were finished, the porch looked exactly the way it had when Rose was alive, white with blue trim, just the way she liked it. Walter looked at the porch for a long time. Then he sat down in the rocking chair that nobody had sat in for 3 years. And he rocked, and he looked at the garden that Rose had planted, the garden that had died and been dead for 3 years, and he said, very quietly, to no one in particular, she would have liked this. The next week, June the librarian showed up with a flat of marigold seedlings and a bag of potting soil. She didn't ask permission, she just knelt down in the dead garden and started planting. Walter watched her from the porch for about 10 minutes. Then he stood up, walked down the steps, lowered himself carefully to his knees beside her, and put his hands in the dirt. They planted the whole garden that afternoon. Not roses, not yet. Marigolds and sunflowers and a few tomato plants that probably wouldn't survive the Iowa winter, but that looked alive and green and hopeful in the November soil. It wasn't Rose's garden. It would never be Rose's garden, but it was a garden. And gardens, like people, have a way of growing back from nothing if someone gives them enough attention. The town of Cedar Falls, Iowa, population 8,000, had discovered something that the rest of the world seemed to have forgotten. That loneliness is not a personal failing, it's a collective one. That when an old man eats alone in a diner for 3 years and nobody asks why, the problem is not the old man. The problem is the nobody. Walter's health improved. Not miraculously, not completely. He was still 78 years old with a heart condition and hands that trembled and eyes that wandered to places no one else could see. But he was better. The color came back to his face. The weight came back to his frame. The nurse who visited 3 times a week said his blood pressure had dropped and his appetite had increased, and that whatever was happening, it was working. What was happening was simple. He was being seen. He was being known. He was being treated not as a fixture or a character or a sad old man in a corner booth, but as a human being with a history and a heart and a story that mattered. That was all. That was everything. Elena's mother passed away on a Sunday in March. Elena sat in the funeral home and felt the same heavy, crushing absence that Walter had described. The same sense that the world had a hole in it that nothing could fill. The same terrible understanding that some people, when they leave, take a part of you with them that you will never get back. Walter came to the funeral. He wore a black suit that he must have dug out of the back of his closet because it smelled like cedar and mothballs and another decade. He walked up to Elena, who was standing beside the casket, and he took her hand. He didn't say, "I'm sorry for your loss." He didn't say, "She's in a better place." He didn't say any of the things that people say when they don't know what to say. He said, "Tell me about her." And Elena, standing in a funeral home in Cedar Falls, Iowa, with the smell of flowers and candle wax in the air and the weight of grief pressing down on her chest, looked at this old man who knew more about loss than anyone she had ever met. And she told him about her mother. She told him about the woman who taught third graders and baked brownies for the neighbors and sang in the shower and danced in the kitchen and remembered every birthday and every anniversary and every small thing that mattered until the disease came and took the memories away, one by one, like a thief in the night. Walter listened. He held her hand, and when she was finished, he said, "She sounds like someone Rose would have loved." It was the kindest thing anyone had ever said to her. After her mother's funeral, Elena went through a dark period, the kind of darkness that doesn't announce itself. It just settles in, like fog, and before you know it, you can't see 3 feet in front of you. She went to work. She served tables. She smiled at customers. But inside, she was hollow. The 2 people she had been taking care of, her mother and Walter, one was gone and the other was stable. And without the constant urgency of caregiving, she didn't know who she was. It was Walter who noticed. Of course it was Walter. The man who had spent 3 years being invisible had become, through the alchemy of attention and love, the most observant person in the diner. He noticed that Elena's smile didn't reach her eyes. He noticed that she had lost weight. He noticed that she was working double shifts, not because she needed the money, but because she was afraid to go home to the empty house where her mother's things were still packed in boxes she couldn't bring herself to open. One Tuesday, when she brought his coffee, he looked at her and said, "Sit down, Elena." She sat. "You're not okay," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm fine, Walter." "No, you're not. I know what not fine looks like. I wore it on my face for 3 years, and I can see it on yours." Elena stared at the table. She traced a scratch in the laminate with her fingernail, and then, without planning to, without deciding to, she started to talk. She talked about her mother, about the guilt she felt for being relieved that it was over, about the shame of that relief, about the loneliness of being 27 years old in a small town where everyone was either much older or had already left, about the fear that she had given up the best years of her life for a woman who couldn't remember her name, and that now those years were gone and she would never get them back. Walter listened. He held his coffee cup in both hands and listened the way Elena had listened to him, with his whole self, with the patience of a man who understood that sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is let them empty themselves out. When she was finished, he reached across the table and put his hand over hers. His skin was papery and warm, and his fingers trembled, but his grip was firm. "You didn't give up your best years," he said. "You spent them doing the most important thing a person can do. You were there. When it mattered most, you were there. Your mother knew that. Even when she couldn't remember your name, she knew you were there. I promise you, she knew." Elena cried. Right there at table 7 in the middle of the lunch rush, with Big Jim watching from the kitchen and Mrs. Henderson pretending not to notice from table 3. She cried the way Walter had cried in the hospital bed. Quietly, with control, with the relief of someone who has been carrying a weight they didn't realize was crushing them until someone said the words that made it okay to set it down. From that day forward, they took care of each other. That was the arrangement. Not spoken, not negotiated, just understood. Walter came to the diner every day, and Elena sat with him, and they talked, and they listened, and they filled the empty spaces in each other's lives with the simple, sustaining presence of another human being who gave a damn. Elena started taking classes online, social work, the degree she already had, but updated, refreshed, aimed at a new direction. She wanted to work with elderly people. She wanted to create programs that connected isolated seniors with their communities. She wanted to make sure that no one else in Cedar Falls or anywhere sat alone at a table for 3 years while the world walked past. Walter helped her with her homework. Not the academic parts, obviously. The human parts. The case studies and the field observations and the understanding of what it feels like to be old and alone and invisible in a world that worships youth and speed and noise. He was her textbook, her primary source, her living, breathing, trembling-handed proof that the work she wanted to do mattered. Walter lived for another 2 years after Elena's mother passed. Good years, full years, years with chicken soup and grilled cheese and black coffee and apple pie with no ice cream. Years with conversations and visitors and books from the library and big band music on a portable player. Years with a town that had learned to see him. Years with a garden that bloomed every spring, and a porch that gleamed white with blue trim, and a rocking chair where he sat on warm evenings and listened to the birds, and thought about Rose, and felt, for the first time since she died, that the world was not empty, just different. He died on a Saturday morning in October, the same month Rose had died. Elena liked to think that wasn't a coincidence. They found him in his bed, fully dressed, wearing the brown corduroy jacket and the white shirt and the gray slacks. His shoes were on, his hair was combed, the wedding ring was on his finger, and on the nightstand beside him, propped up against the lamp, was a photograph of Rose. She was laughing. Her eyes were crinkled at the corners. Her dark, curly hair was blowing in the wind. She looked like a woman who had spent her whole life being loved and knew it and was grateful for it. Underneath the photograph was a note, written in Walter's trembling handwriting, on a piece of Rosie's diner stationery that he must have taken from the napkin dispenser. It said, "Rose, I kept my promise. I never ate alone. A kind girl made sure of it. You would have liked her. I'm coming home now. Save me a seat." Elena found the note when she went to his house to help prepare for the funeral. She stood in that bedroom, surrounded by photographs of Rose holding a piece of diner stationery in her trembling hands, and she read those words 3 times. Each time they hit differently. The first time, they broke her. The second time, they healed her. The third time, they filled her with a purpose she hadn't felt since she left Chicago. The funeral was held at the Methodist Church on Main Street. Elena had expected a small service, a handful of people, the pastor, maybe Earl and June and Betty, maybe a few of the diner regulars. 200 people showed up. They filled every pew. They stood along the walls. They spilled out into the hallway and onto the steps outside, where someone had set up a speaker so they could hear the service. 200 people in a town of 8,000. 1 out of every 40 residents of Cedar Falls, Iowa, had come to say goodbye to the old man who ate alone at Rosie's diner. Big Jim closed the diner for the day. He wore a suit that was too small and a tie that was too wide, and he stood at the back of the church with his arms crossed and his jaw set and his eyes red. And when someone asked him if he was okay, he said, "I'm fine," in a voice that made it clear he was not fine at all. Elena read the note at the funeral. She read it standing at the pulpit, in front of 200 people, half the town who had come to say goodbye. She read it with a steady voice and a broken heart, and the understanding that some stories don't have happy endings. They have real endings. Endings that hurt and heal at the same time. Endings that teach you something about what it means to be alive. When she finished reading, the church was silent. Not the empty silence of a room with nothing to say. The full silence of a room where every person is feeling the same thing at the same time. The silence of 200 people realizing all at once that they had witnessed something rare. A love that lasted 52 years. A promise that was kept. A man who was saved, not by medicine or money or miracles, but by a waitress who noticed he was gone. After the funeral, Earl the farmer stood up and said he wanted to plant roses in Walter's garden. Real roses. The kind Rose used to grow. He said he didn't know much about roses, but he figured he could learn. June, the librarian, said she would find a book about it. Betty said she would supervise. The music teacher said she would bring her students to help. They planted the roses the following Saturday. 12 bushes, red and pink and white and yellow. They put them in the same spots where Rose's original garden had been, following the layout from a photograph that Elena had found in the house. It was November, and the timing was wrong, and any gardener would have told them to wait until spring. But they planted them anyway, because some things can't wait, and because Rose would have understood. The roses survived the winter, every single one of them. The garden bloomed the following May, and it was beautiful. Not as beautiful as Rose's original garden, because no garden would ever be that, but beautiful enough. Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're planted by people who care. The next day, Elena went to the diner. She worked her shift. She served the lunch crowd, and at 11:45, she looked at table 7. It was empty. She walked over. She put her hand on the back of the chair where Walter had sat every day for 5 years. She stood there for a moment, feeling the absence, feeling the weight of the empty space, feeling the ghost of a man who had loved one woman for 52 years and kept his promise to her until the very end. Then she set a cup of black coffee on the table and a slice of apple pie. No ice cream. She didn't know why. It didn't make sense. It was just a gesture, a small, quiet, unreasonable act of love directed at someone who wasn't there anymore. But that's the thing about love. It doesn't stop when someone leaves. It doesn't end when a heart stops beating. It doesn't disappear when a chair goes empty and a table stays set for a guest who will never arrive. Love is the pie on the table, the coffee that goes cold, the chair that stays pulled out, the bell that chimes at 11:45 for a man who will never walk through the door again. Love is the promise you keep, even after the person you made it to is gone. And Elena kept it every day. For as long as that diner stood on Maple Street in Cedar Falls, Iowa, there was a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie at table 7. No ice cream. And if you asked her why, she would smile and say, "It's for a friend." That's not nothing. That's not a small thing. In a world that moves too fast and forgets too easily and looks away too often, that is everything. A cup of coffee, a slice of pie, a table by the window, and the memory of a man who taught an entire town that the most important thing you can do for another human being is the simplest thing in the world. Just sit down and stay. That's what Elena did. That's what the town of Cedar Falls did. That's what Rose had asked for in her final words, without knowing that the promise she extracted from her dying husband would ripple outward through a diner and a waitress and a community until it became something bigger than either of them could have imagined. A promise to never eat alone became a promise to never let anyone eat alone. A dying woman's last wish became a town's quiet revolution, and a man who sat in silence at a corner table for 3 years became the reason that an entire community learned to look up from their own lives long enough to see the people sitting next to them. Walter and Rose are buried side by side in the Cedar Falls Cemetery under a maple tree that turns gold in October. Elena visits them every Sunday. She brings flowers from the garden on Elm Street, which she maintains now with help from Earl and June and Betty and anyone else who wants to get their hands dirty. And every day at 11:45, The bell above the door at Rosie's Diner still chimes, and there is still a cup of coffee and a slice of apple pie at table 7. No ice cream for Walter, for Rose, for every person who has ever eaten alone and wished someone would sit down, just sit down and stay.